The heat wasn't just in the air. It was the air, a physical, shimmering presence that warped the scrubland into an endless mirage. Two men stood on the cracked concrete of a repurposed wartime runway, the kind of place the U.S. government used to bury its mistakes or its secrets. One was Clarence Kelly Johnson, the legendary head of the Lockheed Skunk Works. He was wiry, sharp-eyed, wearing a clean white shirt that seemed to absorb none of the sun's fury. The other was an architect of a new world, CIA Director Allen Dulles. Dulles wore a Panama hat and a suit that looked tailored for a New York boardroom, not a remote Nevada alkali flat. Around them, the dust devils spun, indifferent to the weight of their conversation. Mr. Dulles, Johnson's voice was dry, the sound of paperwork being shuffled. You want eyes over the Soviet Union. You want photographs of their nuclear program. We know where their bases are, roughly. The problem is getting there and back without a declaration of war. Dulles didn't shift his gaze from the distant, hazy mountains. The president's need is absolute, Kelly. The bomber gap, the missile gap, we can't guess anymore. We need facts. We need crystal clear facts. Their MiGs, their AA guns, they're getting too good. Too high. Johnson finally gestured toward a schematic drawing laid out on a makeshift table, held down by cinder blocks against the breeze. It was a peculiar aircraft, a skeletal glider with an almost ludicrous wingspan, an engine barely visible beneath the fuselage, and a cockpit designed for a lone pilot encased in a partial pressure suit. Then you need to stop flying in the air, Johnson said, tapping the drawing. You need to fly above the air. 70,000 feet. That's the ceiling. At that altitude, the air density is less than 2% of sea level. The MiGs can't breathe, the radar struggles, and the flak shells detonate way below our flight path. Dulles leaned in, squinting at the details of the wings. Can it carry the camera equipment? The payload is significant. We're sacrificing speed and defense for altitude. That's the trade. We're stripping it down to the absolute minimum. A single Pratt and Whitney J57 engine, fueled by a special low-vaporizing JPTS kerosene to keep it from boiling at that height. We're designing a machine that is effectively a power glider. We've named the project Aquatone for security, but the aircraft itself, we call it the U-2. The U is for utility, a bureaucratic term to hide a very unutility-like purpose. The entire concept flew in the face of conventional aviation wisdom. For decades, fighter planes aimed for greater speed. This plane aimed for greater invisibility. It was designed to fly at the edge of space, a silver needle against the blackness, utterly exposed but utterly untouchable. The pilot, too, would be a new breed of spy, not a ground agent or a radio operator, but a man strapped into an airborne coffin, his sole task to keep the delicate machine steady for the massive, revolutionary big camera equipment, BC, tucked into the belly. Dulles finally allowed a thin, satisfied smile. 70,000 feet. If this works, Kelly, you've given us the key to Khrushchev's front door. We'll be reading the numbers on his bombers from a distance no one thought possible. But in the distant Kremlin, military analysts, poring over early, fuzzy intelligence reports about a strange, high-flying American reconnaissance prototype, were dismissive. Marshal Vasilevsky, the grizzled, tough-as-nails chief of the Soviet General Staff, reportedly scoffed. He called the specifications of the alleged U-2 a fantasy, an American boast. A slow-moving aircraft at high altitude, it is more vulnerable to air currents than to our defenses, he was quoted as saying, his arrogance fueled by the belief in the absolute sovereignty of Soviet airspace. The mockery, however, was about to curdle into cold fear. The U-2 program, operating in secret under the guise of an innocuous meteorological study, was about to launch its first operational mission over the very heart of the Soviet military apparatus. The stakes were not just clarity, but peace itself. The first flight was scheduled for July 1956. The Soviets were laughing now, but the laughter would soon stop. June 18, 1956. Wiesbaden Air Base, West Germany. Hangar 17. The laughter was furthest from the mind of Francis Gary Powers. He was 26 years old, a soft-spoken former Air Force pilot from Kentucky who now found himself immersed in a world of profound operational secrecy. His official cover story was that he was a civilian meteorologist working for the National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics, NACA, performing atmospheric research flights at extreme altitudes. The reality was that he was an employee of the CIA's most audacious clandestine unit, the 10-10 Technical Operations Detachment. Powers stood next to the sleek, black aircraft, the U-2. The plane looked impossibly fragile, its glider-like wings stretching over 80 feet, designed to capture the barest whisper of lift from the stratospheric air. It was a beautiful, lethal deception. Every inch of the machine, from the custom-made BCE camera in the fuselage to the heat-resistant paint, screamed espionage. His pre-flight routine was a ritual of meticulous preparation and existential dread. The stakes of this flight, the first operational deep penetration mission into the Soviet Union, were almost unimaginable. The objective, Moscow. The target, the Soviet ICBM test and development facilities at Kapustin Yar, and the main strategic bomber base at Sverdlovsk. The mission name, Operation Overflight. Powers' greatest tool, and his greatest vulnerability, was the sheer altitude. He would be flying in an environment closer to space than to Earth. At 70,000 feet, without the protection of the cockpit and his specialized gear, his blood would instantly boil and his lungs would collapse. It was a pressure cooker ride in a fragile aluminum shell. Today, his focus was the MC-3 partial pressure suit. It wasn't the bulky astronaut gear of the future, but a complex assembly of rubberized fabric and mechanical linkages that encased his body. He went through the checklist with the crew chief, Chief Master Sergeant Bill Wilson, his voice low and clinical. "Seal check on the gloves, Gary. I need absolute certainty on the pressure integrity," Wilson instructed, running his hand over the seams of the custom-fitted leather gloves that attached to the suit's arms. The suit was necessary because the cockpit of the U-2 was not fully pressurized. It maintained a cabin altitude of about 29,000 feet, still higher than Mount Everest. If the canopy seal failed, if a stray piece of debris or a catastrophic engine flameout caused the pressure to drop, the suit would automatically inflate, keeping Powers alive for the few minutes needed for an emergency descent. It was a lonely, terrifying reliance on technology. He wore the suit, but he was still fundamentally alone, a single human atom riding a whisper of air above a geopolitical powder keg. Inside the cramped cockpit, the world shrank to the instruments, the drift sight, used for aligning the camera over the target, the engine temperature gauges, and most crucially, the true airspeed indicator. At 70,000 feet, the operational envelope for the U-2 was razor thin. Powers had to keep the aircraft flying in a dangerous thermal slot, the narrow band between the stall speed, where the thin air couldn't support the wings, and the high-speed Mach limit, where the aircraft would break apart due to aerodynamic stress. They called it the coffin corner. A deviation of just 5 knots either way meant potential disaster. The weather forecast for the following week was favorable. Clear skies over the Soviet heartland. Perfect photographic conditions. But every man on the ground knew the inherent danger. Eisenhower had reluctantly authorized the mission, but only after fierce debate. He understood that these photos were essential to dispelling the myth of a massive Soviet bomber arsenal, the so-called missile gap that Moscow was deliberately cultivating. But he also understood the political risk. If Powers was shot down or captured, it wouldn't just be an aircraft lost. It would be a catastrophic diplomatic failure, an act of open aggression the Soviets could use to derail any hope of Cold War détente. "We need the photographs, Gary," Dulles had told him during a briefing months earlier. "We need the truth, whatever the cost." As the crew sealed the canopy over him, the roar of the Pratt and Whitney engine filling the hangar, Powers adjusted his mask. He was strapped into a complex, flying camera, ready to depart from the safety of West German airspace and become a solitary speck of silver traversing the most heavily defended zone on Earth. The time for laughter was indeed over. The time for reckoning was approaching. July 4th, 1956. 6:15 Zulu time. 71,500 feet above Brest, Soviet Belarusian SSR. The air was thin, cold, and utterly black, even with the sun rising. Below him, the world was a sprawling, distorted map of forests, rivers, and the rigid geometry of Soviet infrastructure. France's Gary Powers felt less like a pilot and more like a man floating in a bell jar, completely isolated. The U-2 was performing exactly as promised, a silent, silver ghost riding the jet stream. The engine note was a muffled thrum, almost hypnotic. Powers' primary challenge was not maneuvering, but holding the aircraft absolutely steady. The big camera equipment, BC, a state-of-the-art camera system developed by James Baker and the PerkinElmer Corporation, was running. It used a massive spool of thin film, capable of capturing images with a resolution so fine, intelligence analysts claimed they could read the numbers on a license plate, if there were license plates in the air at 70,000 feet. As he crossed the border, the immense weight of the mission settled in. He was an invited guest to a high-altitude game of hide-and-seek, one where the loser paid with their life and possibly triggered a global war. Down on the ground, in the regional headquarters of the Soviet Air Defense Forces, PVO Strany, the early warning radar screens began to register a ghost. The operator, a young lieutenant named Dmitry Volkov, stared at the tiny, barely perceptible blip that materialized well beyond the expected range of any known Western aircraft. It was flying at an altitude his instruments insisted was physically impossible. Volkov frantically cross-checked the data. The altitude reading, over 21 kilometers, was dismissed by a superior officer, a Captain Sergei Malenkov, as an instrument malfunction, probably due to atmospheric interference or a weather balloon. "Lieutenant, clear the screen. That's clutter. The Americans do not possess aircraft capable of holding that height. It is a boast, not a reality," Malenkov stated, dismissing the sighting with the arrogance common among officers who believed in the infallible superiority of Soviet technology. But the blip was persistent. It tracked inward, over Minsk, following the predetermined route aimed squarely at the Soviet military-industrial heartland. Malenkov, despite his initial dismissal, authorized a scramble. 3 MiG-17 Fresco fighters, the pride of the Soviet short-range interceptor fleet, were launched from a nearby base. Their pilots were instructed to fly a defensive vector and investigate the high-altitude anomaly. The orders were simple: locate and, if confirmed hostile, engage. The Soviet pilots, flying in the dense air of the high troposphere, pushed their machines to their absolute ceiling, around 55,000 feet, 16.7 kilometers. They reached their apex, their engines gasping for oxygen, their controls sloppy and unresponsive. The ground control operator, his voice tight with frustration, radioed the result. "Target confirmed. Sector leader. We can see the contrail. High above us. It is a thin, white line impossibly high, but we cannot reach it. We are stalled out. We are turning back, Comrade Captain." Powers, glancing down through the canopy from his serene vantage point, saw the telltale wisps of the MiG contrails far below him. They looked like vapor trails left by tiny insects, puffing out below his flight path, utterly harmless. He was flying not just above their weapon envelope, but above their physical endurance. The Soviet pilots were not even close. Their inability to reach him was the ultimate confirmation of Kelly Johnson's genius. The U-2 was, for now, untouchable. He pressed onward, crossing the mighty Volga River, the camera in the belly relentlessly consuming film. The targets were coming up now. The vast, sprawling industrial complexes, the railway lines, and finally, the distinctive layout of a secret long-range aviation, LRA, airbase. Powers clicked the camera into its highest resolution mode. The photographs he was taking, though still unseen, were already rewriting the strategic balance of power. They were confirming, in stark, undeniable detail, what Eisenhower desperately needed to know. The Soviet bomber fleet, which Moscow had paraded so convincingly on May Day, was far smaller than Western estimates suggested. There was no bomber gap. The U-2's success on this first flight was absolute. It was a humiliating demonstration of technical supremacy. The Soviets had been mocked not by a hostile military threat, but by a photographic flash in the sky. And the political storm in Moscow was about to break. July 5th, 1956. Noon. The Kremlin, Moscow. The air inside the massive, ornate conference room was thick with smoke and barely concealed rage. The chief of the General Staff, Marshal Vasily Sokolovsky, stood before the Politburo, his face pale beneath his military tan. His hands held not a strategic map, but a series of cryptic, typed reports detailing the events of the previous day. Nikita Khrushchev, the first secretary, sat at the head of the table, his usual boisterous energy replaced by a simmering, dangerous stillness. He thumped his fist on the table, not hard enough to break it, but loud enough to silence the murmurs of his subordinates. "Explain, Marshal," Khrushchev demanded, his voice dangerously low. "Explain how an American aircraft, which your intelligence analysts dismissed as fantasy, flew for 2,000 kilometers over the heart of our fatherland, over our most sensitive installations, and was met only with the futile contrails of our most modern fighters." Sokolovsky swallowed hard. The truth was professionally devastating. Comrade First Secretary, our air defense doctrine assumed a maximum ceiling of 18 kilometers for any sustained reconnaissance flight. This aircraft, based on radar tracks and the reports of the scrambled MiG pilots, was flying above 21 kilometers, over 70,000 feet. Our radar struggled to track it consistently, and our best interceptors, the MiG-17s, the new Su-9 prototypes, cannot physically reach that altitude. They stall out. The shell bursts from the S-75 Dvina anti-aircraft missile system, while powerful, are calibrated for lower flying targets. Its range simply cannot extend that high. The generals seated around the table shifted uncomfortably. They had built the most formidable conventional air defense system in the world, a dense, layered wall of radar, guns, and jets designed to make Soviet airspace impenetrable. Yet, a single unescorted American glider had effortlessly bypassed their entire technological shield. It was not just a security breach. It was a profound technological humiliation. Andrei Gromyko, the veteran diplomat, leaned forward, his expression grave. "This is not just a military failure. Marshal, this is a political catastrophe. Imagine the propaganda victory for Washington. They are taking pictures of our nuclear secrets, mapping our strategic rocket forces before they are fully operational. They're showing the world that our defensive umbrella is a sieve. This undermines all our claims of military parity." Khrushchev leaned back, his eyes narrowed. He was a master of bluster and carefully calibrated threats, but his power relied heavily on the perception of Soviet strength. The U-2 attack was an immediate, existential threat to that perception. "So what is the plan?" Khrushchev roared, finally releasing some of his fury. "Do we scramble every fighter in the Western District every time this American mosquito decides to take a photograph? We must find a way to neutralize this aircraft. Not just shoot it down, we must capture it. We must show the world the physical evidence of this gross act of espionage inside our sovereign territory. Until then, we are flying blind, and they're reading our mail." Orders were immediately dispatched. The Soviet military machine, stung by the insult, mobilized. Resources were poured into two immediate, competing programs. Project Z, the anti-U-2 solution, a desperate, accelerated program to re-engineer existing Soviet aircraft, notably the high-altitude MiG-19 and the new heavy interceptor prototypes, to increase their service ceilings, perhaps by stripping weight or adapting specialized high-altitude ammunition. They needed a technical countermeasure, and they needed it yesterday. Increased secrecy and deception. All strategic bomber and missile sites that had been photographed were immediately placed under strict operational security. Decoy equipment was moved onto airfields, and the construction schedule for the ICBM sites was accelerated and disguised. The Soviets began playing a strategic game of mirrors, hoping the next U, U-2 flight would capture only misleading information. The CIA, analyzing the successful mission film back in Washington, was already savoring the victory. The crystal-clear negatives confirmed the intelligence analyst's best-case scenario. The missile gap was a myth engineered by the Soviets. The Bison bomber fleet was dangerously small. The U-2 had just delivered the strategic intelligence that would shape American defense policy for the next decade. The Soviets, for their part, would spend the next 4 years obsessed with one single, frustrating, high-flying problem. The U-2 had become their ghost, their technological obsession, and their political nightmare. They knew the Americans would be back. It was just a matter of when. July 15, 1956. National Photographic Interpretation Center, NPIC, Washington, D.C. The temporary facility in Washington was buzzing with an intensity that bordered on religious fervor. This was where the raw film from Power's successful overflight mission, designated Operation Overflight 1, was being processed and analyzed. The work was painstaking, requiring magnifying glasses, stereoscopic viewers, and endless rolls of high-contrast, black-and-white film. The lead photo interpreter, a meticulous, quiet man named Art Lundahl, felt the weight of history in his hands. He and his team were the first to see the unvarnished truth of the Soviet military establishment. The moment he looked through the loop at the images of the Engels long-range aviation base, the entire strategic landscape of the Cold War began to shift. "Look at this," Lundahl murmured to his assistant, pointing to a series of distinctive V-shaped silhouettes parked neatly on the apron. The Myasishchev M4 Bison bombers, the ones they paraded over Tushino airfield. The intelligence community had been convinced the Soviets possessed hundreds of these formidable long-range bombers, creating the terrifying bomber gap that was driving defense, spending, and public fear in the West. The fear was that the Soviets could launch a devastating first strike on American cities. Lundahl counted methodically. The resolution was astounding. The shadows of the rivets, the markings on the tail fins, every detail was captured with surgical clarity from 13 miles up. "We have 55 aircraft, maximum, across all primary bases we covered," Lundahl announced, his voice tight with the significance of the finding. 55. Not the hundreds the Air Force intelligence estimated. They've been using the same aircraft, repainted or rotated, in their parades and flyovers to inflate the numbers. It's a deliberate deception. The implications were staggering. The U-2 had just single-handedly revealed the foundation of Soviet military parity was built on a bluff. The massive investment the U.S. was about to pour into its own bomber fleet and continental defense systems was, in part, based on a phantom threat. The debriefing to President Dwight D. Eisenhower was held a few days later, a highly classified meeting in the Oval Office. Eisenhower, a career military man and strategist, studied the blow-ups of the Kapustin missile test range. He focused on the pictures of the launch pads and the assembly buildings. Allen Dulles, the CIA director, presented the findings with quiet triumph. "Mr. President, the intelligence is conclusive. The current threat from long-range Soviet bombers is manageable. More importantly, we have the first irrefutable evidence of the progress, or lack thereof, at their intercontinental ballistic missile facilities." The photographs showed only the very early stages of ICBM development. The infrastructure was primitive. The readiness level was years behind the alarmist estimates of the Pentagon. The missile gap, much like the bomber gap, was a strategic fantasy. Eisenhower, who had fought the political pressure to dramatically increase defense spending based on these phantom gaps, was profoundly relieved. The U-2 had given him the ultimate political shield, the truth. He could now authorize defense budgets based on reality, not fear, saving the American taxpayer billions, and, critically, avoiding a panicked, full-scale acceleration of the arms race. "This is why we took the risk, gentlemen," Eisenhower said, tapping a photograph of a missile assembly building. "This aircraft is not just a tool for intelligence. It is a tool for peace. It allows us to manage the risk. We know what they have, and therefore, we know what we don't need to do. However, the the president was also a realist. He knew that the success was temporary. The Soviets were not technologically static. The mission reports confirmed their desperate efforts to intercept the U-2. Each successful mission increased the risk exponentially. Eisenhower issued a standing, non-negotiable directive. U-2 overflights must be limited to only when critical intelligence was required, and only when the president himself gave direct, personal approval. He understood that the day the U-2 was lost, the intelligence victory would turn into a diplomatic nightmare. They had achieved their initial goal. Now, they were playing for borrowed time, waiting for the inevitable Soviet technological response that would close the 70,000-foot gap. The period between 1956 and 1959 saw intermittent U-2 flights, each one tightening the knot of tension in the Kremlin. The planes provided invaluable details on the Soviet industrial base, submarine yards, and early warning radar networks, forming the backbone of American strategic planning. The Soviets, meanwhile, were closing the net, driven by the personal fury of Khrushchev and the wounded pride of the PVO Strany. Late 1958. Assembly Plant Number 41, Kirov, Soviet Union. The air was heavy with the smell of ozone and freshly machined metal. Inside the dimly lit, cavernous factory, Soviet engineers and technicians were working around the clock on the only weapon system they believed could finally conquer the untouchable U-2, the 75-Dvina NATO designation, SA-2 guideline. The early S-75 systems had been deployed during the initial U-2 overflights in 1956, but their altitude ceiling was insufficient. The rockets simply could not reach the 70,000-foot mark, and their guidance radar, the Fan-Song system, struggled to lock onto the small, high-flying target. Now, driven by Khrushchev's relentless political pressure and the immense embarrassment of continued overflights, the system was undergoing a radical, urgent overhaul. The lead designer, Grigory K. Guskin, a man whose career was now inextricably linked to the failure or success of this single weapon, worked in a state of near-permanent exhaustion. "We must increase the solid fuel booster burn time," Guskin explained to a visiting marshal, pointing at the massive, two-stage missile casing. "The initial thrust is fine, but the second stage needs to sustain its velocity higher into the stratosphere where the air is effectively non-existent. We are modifying the propellant formula. It is dangerous, volatile work, but necessary." The primary technological hurdle wasn't simply reaching the altitude. It was maintaining stability and guidance in the near vacuum. The engineers developed new, refined control surfaces and, crucially, a new warhead fuse calibrated to explode at precisely the U-2's cruising altitude. The goal was no longer a direct hit, which was unlikely given the U-2's speed and altitude, but a massive burst of shrapnel from the high-explosive fragmentation warhead, creating a lethal cloud of metal just beneath or beside the U-2's flight path. Parallel to the hardware upgrades, the PVO Strany commanders focused on adapting their tactics. They realized that a single, isolated S-75 battery was insufficient. The U-2 was simply too fast, and the Fan-Song radar required too much time to acquire and track the target. The new doctrine was simple, brutal, and expensive, simultaneous saturation. Instead of one battery firing, an entire complex of missile batteries would be secretly relocated and deployed along the predicted flight path of the American spy plane. When a U-2 was detected and tracked, not one, but 3 or 4 S-75 sites would unleash a coordinated salvo, a wall of missiles, at the same point in the sky. If the first 2 batteries missed, the third and fourth would be detonating their warheads in the same air, maximizing the chance of creating a crippling shrapnel cloud. The location for the final decisive deployment was chosen with precision. The sensitive areas of the Ural Mountains region, near the industrial city of Sverdlovsk and important ICBM development facilities at Tyuratam, which the Americans were clearly prioritizing in their flight planning. The entire upgrade process was cloaked in the highest secrecy, known only by the codename Vozduk, Air. The CIA, while receiving increasing reports about a new, higher-flying Soviet SAM, surface-to-air missile, consistently underestimated the S-75's final operational ceiling. Their analysts relied on captured intelligence documents that detailed the original specifications, not the frantic, politically driven upgrades of 1958 to 1959. This systemic underestimation would prove fatal. Back at the Skunk Works, Kelly Johnson and his team were aware of the increasing threat. They developed countermeasures, including a sophisticated radar jamming system, System 12, to be deployed on the U-2. However, the system was bulky, unreliable, and required significant power, often competing with the camera payload. Powers and the other 10 to 10 pilots were briefed on the new Soviet missiles. The message was optimistic. The new SAMs are a threat, but at 70,000 feet, you still hold the technological high ground. Use the jamming equipment, fly straight, and stay high. They can reach, but they cannot connect. The pilots, professional and focused, accepted the assessment, but a growing unease settled over the detachment. The operational edge, the untouchable advantage of the U-2, felt like it was beginning to dull. They were no longer flying over a defensive void. They were flying over a technologically determined and very angry opponent. The trap was set, waiting for the perfect moment and the perfect flight path. April 28, 1960. CIA Headquarters, Langley, Virginia. The need for new, critical intelligence was once again overwhelming President Eisenhower's deep-seated caution. The window of opportunity for a major, final overflight was closing. The Americans were planning a crucial four-power summit in Paris with the Soviets for mid-May, intended to discuss disarmament and a possible end to the immediate Cold War thaw. Eisenhower desperately wanted to enter those negotiations holding the definitive proof of Soviet strategic capability, or lack thereof, in his hand. The primary intelligence gap was now focusing on the Soviet Union's most secretive facility, the Tyuratam Test Range, later known as the Baikonur Cosmodrome. This was where the Soviets were reportedly perfecting their first true intercontinental ballistic missile, ICBM, the R-7 Semyorka. If the R-7 was near operational readiness, it completely changed the dynamic of the Paris summit. If it was still in the early testing phase, Eisenhower could negotiate from a position of relative confidence. CIA Director Allen Dulles presented the final proposal for Operation Grand Slam to the president. It was the most ambitious U-2 flight yet, a single nonstop penetration flight spanning over 4,000 miles, taking off from Peshawar, Pakistan, traversing the entire length of the Soviet heartland, including the high-priority ICBM sites at Tyuratam, the industrial hub of Sverdlovsk, and the heavily defended nuclear facilities in the Urals, before landing in Bodo, Norway. The Soviets have improved their S-75 system, Mr. President, Dulles admitted, placing the latest intelligence assessment on the desk. We estimate their operational ceiling is now near 60,000 feet, perhaps even 65,000 on a lucky shot. But our U-2 will maintain a ceiling of 70,500 feet, utilizing the absolute latest in JPTS fuel density. It remains a safe margin. Dulles intentionally downplayed the CIA's knowledge of the radical, politically motivated S-75 upgrades carried out under Project Vozduk. The agency, fueled by its own success and the perceived technological superiority of the U-2, maintained a confidence that bordered on hubris. They genuinely believed the plane was untouchable. Eisenhower was agonizing. He looked at the proposed flight path, a deep dagger thrust through the Soviet Union. Gentlemen, the proximity of the Paris summit makes this a profound risk. If this mission goes forward, it must be completed and analyzed before I sit across the table from Khrushchev. If anything happens, he paused, the gravity of the potential diplomatic fallout weighing on him. If the aircraft is lost and we are exposed, the summit is dead. It will be seen as an aggressive, calculated act of sabotage. The military brass, however, was adamant. They argued that the risk was worth the strategic payoff. Without confirmation of Tyuratam's status, they argued, the United States was negotiating in the dark potentially agreeing to disarmament terms while the Soviets secretly rushed an ICBM into deployment. On April 29th, Eisenhower, facing the dilemma of having to choose between political safety and strategic clarity, made the fateful decision. He signed the authorization. The launch window was narrow. The flight had to be completed by May 2nd at the absolute latest, allowing for time to process the film before the Paris meeting. The mission was set for May 1st, 1960, a date chosen for its clear weather forecast. And, ironically, May Day, the most politically symbolic day in the Soviet calendar. The pressure on the pilot for this mission, Francis Gary Powers, operating out of the makeshift CIA forward operating base at Peshawar, was immense. This was not a routine reconnaissance mission. It was a diplomatic time bomb wrapped in an aircraft. Powers was aware of the significance. He was ordered to fly a precise, unvarying course, to conserve every ounce of the volatile fuel, and to, above all, maintain altitude. In the cockpit, stowed away in a secret compartment, Powers carried two critical, final items that underscored the gravity of the risk. A CIA-issued silver dollar containing a fast-acting suicide needle, a tiny dose of saxitoxin, to be used in the event of capture, and a set of strict self-destruct instructions for the U-2's sensitive camera equipment and all classified materials, to be activated immediately if the aircraft was compromised. The Americans knew that capturing the plane and its revolutionary technology intact would be as great a propaganda victory for the Soviets as the photos were a strategic victory for the U.S. Powers was being sent across the most dangerous line in the world, equipped with the means to take his life and erase the evidence, just in case the untouchable was finally touched. May 1st, 1960, 6:26 local time, Peshawar Air Base, Pakistan. The morning air in Pakistan was already heavy with the promise of oppressive heat, but here, on the dimly lit runway, the focus was absolute zero. The U-2C, designated Article 360, sat ready, its huge wings almost touching the ground, needing temporary support wheels, known as pogos, to keep the delicate structure level before liftoff. Francis Gary Powers was sealed inside the cockpit, the air conditioning struggling to keep the humidity from fogging his helmet visor. The launch sequence was agonizingly slow. The U-2 required a long, deliberate taxi and a smooth, unhurried takeoff run to gain the necessary airspeed for its thin wing design. Powers released the brakes. The Pratt & Whitney J75 engine, a more powerful variant than the original J57, began to roar, pushing the highly specialized aircraft down the runway. As the plane gained speed, the pogos detached with a clatter and bounced away. Powers guided the U-2 into the sky, beginning the long, slow, 3-hour climb that would take him from the heavy atmosphere of the surface to the ethereal realm of the stratosphere. His initial trajectory was northwest, climbing steadily over the rugged terrain of Afghanistan, a neutral territory used as a staging ground for the ascent. The internal cabin pressure struggled against the rising altitude, eventually stabilizing at the equivalent of 29,000 feet, while outside, the true altitude climbed higher and higher. At 70,500 feet, Powers leveled off. The U-2 was riding its ceiling, perched delicately in the coffin corner, the narrow 5-knot margin between stalling and overspeeding. He could see the curvature of the earth, a sublime, terrifying view that emphasized his profound isolation. 8:53 local time. Powers reached the border, the razor-sharp, politically charged dividing line between Afghanistan and the Soviet Turkmen SSR. He checked his instrument panel. The BCE camera systems were engaged, automatically tracking the pre-programmed route over the Caspian Sea region. The film spools began to turn, recording the desert landscape and the vast, strategically important railway lines that fed the Soviet military machine. The silence in the cockpit was almost complete, broken only by the hiss of the oxygen and the low thrum of the engine. Powers was alone, a silent, unseen witness. Down on the ground, in the Turkmen Military District PVO headquarters, the radar console lit up with the telltale, persistent high-altitude blip. This time, The reaction was immediate and devoid of the 1956 dismissiveness. The years of frustration and the direct, humiliating orders from Khrushchev had ensured an instantaneous response. Target confirmed high. Altitude confirmed above 21 kilometers. The controller barked into the microphone. This is not clutter. This is the American Ghost. Operation Vozduk is initiated. Alert all batteries along the Sverdlovsk corridor. The PVO commanders knew the MiG fighters were useless at this altitude. They didn't bother scrambling them as an intercept force. They used them as spotters, trying to visually confirm the contrail and help triangulate the radar tracks. The battle would be fought exclusively by the ground-based missiles. Powers, checking his rearview mirror for contrails, saw nothing. Only the black void above and the blue marble below. The jamming equipment, the System 12, was theoretically operational, broadcasting high-powered static to confuse the Soviet fan song tracking radar. He flew straight and true, focusing on maintaining his precise speed and altitude. He was flying over the highly sensitive industrial and military area of the southern Urals, heading directly toward the major target areas. Unbeknownst to him, the Soviet Union had spent 4 years staging this reception, along the specific predetermined flight path that the CIA had chosen. The path leading to Sverdlovsk, 3 separate 75 Vina batteries, fully upgraded and armed with the new, high-altitude warheads, were already in their final firing positions. The Soviet doctrine of simultaneous saturation was being executed perfectly. The batteries were electronically linked, their radar systems working in concert, fighting through the U-2's jamming signals. They were patiently waiting for the plane to reach the most restricted air zone, a point of no return deep within the heart of the motherland, where political and military targets were clustered closest together. The tension was palpable, split between the silent, serene flight of the pilot and the frantic, coordinated activity of thousands of soldiers on the ground, all focused on one tiny, silver speck in the sky. Powers was mere minutes away from the first designated target, the industrial hub of Sverdlovsk, and the heavily defended corridor where the Soviet trap lay sprung and waiting. May 1st, 1960, 8:53 Moscow time. Sverdlovsk Missile Defense Corridor, Soviet Ural Mountains. Powers entered the high-risk zone. The U-2, silent and steady, was directly above the planned firing location, flying at a perfect, programmed altitude of 70,500 feet. Below him, unseen and unheard, was a deadly ballet of Soviet coordination. 3 separate S-75 Dvina batteries, codenamed Complex 1, 2, and 3, had their fan-song radar systems locked onto the elusive American Ghost. Inside the command bunker of Complex 2, Major Mikhail Voronov, a grim-faced PVO officer, stared at the tracking scope. The blip was small, flickering against the residual jamming signal from the U-2 System 12, but it was solid. They had tracked this exact flight path, the corridor leading to the high-value Tyuratom sites, countless times during their exercises. This was not a test. This was the moment of reckoning for 4 years of humiliation. Target is locked and tracked by all 3 complexes, Voronov announced, his voice tight but controlled. Altitude confirms 21.5 kilometers. Engage. Fire. The order went out simultaneously to the 6 massive, 2-stage missiles on their launch rails across the 3 sites. The world above Sverdlovsk suddenly exploded in a rush of noise and smoke. 6 V-750 missiles, each carrying a massive high-explosive fragmentation warhead, ignited their solid fuel boosters. The tremendous initial thrust hurled the rockets skyward, shedding their boosters almost instantly and transitioning into the sustained burn of the second stage. They climbed in terrifying arcs, faster and faster, guided by ground-based radar beams toward the predicted intersection point of the U-2's serene trajectory. Powers, peering out of his cockpit, registered a fleeting peripheral flicker of movement far below. It looked like 6 vertical columns of smoke punching through the lower atmosphere. He didn't immediately recognize the existential danger. He had been briefed that they might attempt firing, but his altitude made the threat theoretical. Seconds later, however, the sky around the U-2 was no longer black. It was illuminated by a blinding flash of orange light. The warheads of the first two missiles, those fired by Complex 1, had detonated at their maximum calibrated altitude, just below and slightly behind the U-2. The sound reached Powers not as a traditional explosion, but as a dull, violent thump that shuddered through the aircraft structure. The shock wave, even in the extremely thin air, was substantial. Then came the impact of the shrapnel, thousands of fragments of steel traveling at hypersonic velocity. Powers later described it as a sudden, massive burst of light and power, followed by the terrifying, deafening sound of a hail of metal striking the fuselage. The U-2, designed for stealth and high altitude, not combat, was instantly crippled. A massive hole was torn in the rear section of the fuselage. The powerful fragmentation strike instantly disabled the tail section and the critical flight control systems. The aircraft instantly began to yaw violently. More critically, the shockwave ruptured the canopy and depressurized the cabin. Powers was instantly thrown into a brutal, tumbling fight for his life. The rapid decompression was instantaneous. He gasped for air as the sudden pressure change hammered his inner ears. But his partially pressurized suit inflated automatically, clamping down around his body and keeping him functional. The U-2 pitched violently nose down, entering a flat, uncontrollable spin. The plane was breaking apart in the stratosphere, the fragile wings unable to handle the excessive G-forces of the rapid descent. The camera systems, the navigation equipment, and the radio gear all went silent. Powers' first frantic thought was the mandatory protocol. Activate the self-destruct switch located on the instrument panel, ensuring the CIA's secrets would not fall into Soviet hands. He struggled against the violent G-forces pinning him to his seat, reaching for the switch, but the plane was already disintegrating around him. As the plane tumbled, Powers was thrown free of the controls. At an altitude somewhere between 40,000 and 30,000 feet, the aircraft structure failed completely. The immense forces ripped the tail and wings clean off. Powers' last conscious action was to reach for the emergency ejection levers, fighting the centrifugal force as the crippled aircraft plunged into the lower atmosphere. He punched out. The ejection was incomplete and chaotic, but he was clear of the wreckage. He was falling, a solitary figure tumbling from the edge of space towards the Soviet Urals, his parachute still unopened. The U-2, the symbol of untouchable American technological supremacy, was scattered in flaming fragments across the vast, heavily guarded Soviet landscape. May 1st, 1960, minutes after the strike. Above Sverdlovsk, Soviet Union. Francis Gary Powers was falling, his body still encased in the protective but cumbersome MC-3 pressure suit. The force of the ejection had been brutal, but he was alive. He struggled with the ripcord, his gloved hands clumsy and uncooperative. The pressure suit, though saving him from instant death by high-altitude decompression, also restricted his movement, complicating the critical task of deploying his chute. He was in free fall, plummeting through the lower stratosphere. Below him, the vast green forests of the Urals rushed into focus. Finally, at a safer, lower altitude, estimated to be around 14,000 feet, Powers managed to deploy his personal parachute. The sudden jerk as the canopy caught the air was jarring, but the immediate sensation was one of profound, terrifying relief. He was descending slowly, helplessly, into the territory of his enemy. His mind immediately cycled back to his training. Evade and escape. The CIA silver dollar with the suicide pin was still in his pocket, but he hesitated. His capture was not yet guaranteed, and the desire to live overwhelmed the order to destroy evidence. He concentrated on landing, maneuvering the chute toward a secluded spot, away from open fields or roads where he might be spotted. As he drifted downward, he saw the shocking spectacle below, the smoldering wreckage of the U-2. Large pieces were still burning, scattering debris over a wide area. Critically, he noticed that the nose section, containing the delicate instruments and the BCE camera housing, appeared largely intact. It had detached from the main fuselage but had not been consumed by fire. The self-destruct command, which he had been unable to initiate, had failed. The Soviets would soon have their hands not only on the aircraft, but on its precious, revolutionary secrets. Powers landed hard in a plowed field near the village of Kozalino, not far from the city of Sverdlovsk. He quickly buried his survival pack and tried to detach himself from the parachute harness. He was surrounded almost immediately. The sight of the crashing aircraft and the subsequent parachute descent had drawn attention from nearby collective farm workers and local villagers. They were not soldiers, but ordinary Soviet citizens, armed with pitchforks, axes, and a fierce, patriotic indignation. A collective farmer named Pavel Makarov was the first to reach him, followed by two women who had been working in the fields. Powers was immediately overwhelmed, disarmed, and roughly searched. He was identified not by his uniform. He was in a civilian flight suit, but by his foreign, tailored clothes and the strange, bulky pressure gear. They found his wallet, containing Soviet currency for emergencies and a few small, nondescriptive pieces of equipment. The local villagers held him in place, their demeanor a mix of fearful curiosity and fierce, patriotic pride at having captured an American spy. It was the first time in his life that Powers understood the visceral meaning of being an enemy of the state. Within the hour, the KGB and the PVO military units descended upon the area. Powers was quickly taken into custody by military intelligence officers. He was stripped of his pressure suit and searched thoroughly. The suicide pin, concealed within the silver dollar, was discovered and confiscated. His mission was officially and irrevocably compromised. Meanwhile, the Soviet recovery teams, working under the direct, feverish supervision of Major Voronov, were already combing the crash site. They quickly located the key prize, the massive, slightly dented, but largely intact nose section containing the BCE camera system and the entire crucial film from the Tyuratam overflight. They also retrieved the specialized JPTS fuel samples, the radar jamming equipment, and the unique pressure suit. Every single piece of technology the CIA had deemed untouchable. The political significance was understood instantly in the command bunker. They hadn't just shot down the U-2. They had captured the spy and his equipment intact. Major Voronov immediately contacted Moscow. Comrade Marshal, the mission is a complete success. The aircraft is destroyed, the pilot is captured, and the equipment, the key photographic equipment and film, are recovered. The American spy is in our custody. The news reached Khrushchev's desk like a thunderbolt. The humiliation of 1956 had been spectacularly reversed in 1960. Khrushchev saw the political opportunity not just to close the air gap, but to shatter Eisenhower's credibility on the world stage just weeks before the Paris summit. The capture of France's Gary Powers and the secret U-2 technology would become the ultimate political weapon. May 3, 1960, Washington, D.C. and Moscow. The news of the U-2's disappearance was already circulating within high-level CIA and White House circles. Based on protocol and the belief in the plane's self-destruct mechanism, the CIA executed the pre-planned deception, the cover story. On May 3rd, the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, NASA, the CIA's official cover, issued a press release stating that a U-2 meteorological research aircraft flying from Adana, Turkey, on an air sampling mission, had gone missing over the rugged mountains of Turkey, potentially due to pilot oxygen trouble. The press release even included a highly plausible trajectory map that neatly ended at the Turkish border, intentionally avoiding any mention of Soviet airspace. The official story painted the U-2 as an innocuous scientific tool, strayed and lost. The CIA was confident that, even if the Soviets had found wreckage, they would not find the pilot or the camera equipment, thus having no proof of espionage. 2 days later, on May 5th, Nikita Khrushchev stood before the Supreme Soviet in Moscow and delivered a speech that began with a calculated deception of its own. He announced triumphantly that a spy plane had been shot down deep inside the Soviet Union on May Day, confirming the effectiveness of Soviet air defenses. The international community, having heard NASA's story, remained skeptical. They suspected the plane was the U-2, but assumed the Soviet claim of shooting it down was typical Cold War bluster and exaggeration. Then, on May 7th, Khrushchev dropped the second devastating shoe. He returned to the Supreme Soviet and, with theatrical flourish, corrected his previous statement. "I must tell you a secret," he grinned broadly to the astonished assembly. "When I made my first report, I deliberately did not say that the pilot was alive and well. And we have all the wreckage." The revelation was a diplomatic atomic bomb. Khrushchev presented to the world the smoking gun. The captured pilot, Francis Gary Powers, who was now confessing to his espionage role. The pieces of the U-2 wreckage, and, most damagingly, the virtually intact BCE camera and the unexposed film, clearly demonstrating the plane's true purpose was not meteorological research. The Soviets even displayed the custom-made suicide silver dollar as evidence of the CIA's ruthless training. The exposure of the NASA cover story as a deliberate, high-level lie immediately plunged the White House into crisis. President Eisenhower had been caught red-handed. The Soviet strategic victory was now total: military, technological, and propaganda. Eisenhower was faced with a dilemma: continue the obvious lie, or admit the truth and accept the catastrophic political fallout. He chose the latter. On May 11th, the State Department issued a full admission. The U-2 flights were indeed authorized for intelligence gathering, necessary due to the secretive nature of the Soviet Union. Eisenhower personally took full responsibility for the flights. The consequences were immediate and profound. Collapse of the Paris summit. The crucial four-power summit, scheduled for May 16th, was doomed before it began. Khrushchev arrived in Paris, not to negotiate, but to demand a full apology from Eisenhower, a commitment to cease all overflights and the punishment of those responsible. Eisenhower refused to apologize for intelligence gathering, though he promised to suspend the flights. Khrushchev dramatically stormed out, effectively ending the summit and plunging U.S.-Soviet relations back into a deep freeze. Global humiliation. The U-2 incident made America, and specifically Eisenhower, look duplicitous and incompetent. Friendly nations that had unknowingly hosted U-2 bases, such as Pakistan and Norway, were subjected to aggressive Soviet threats. The brief thaw of the late 1950s was over. For Khrushchev, the single act of shooting down the U-2 proved what 4 years of unsuccessful attempts could not. Soviet technology could, and would, close the strategic gap. He had silenced the aerial mockery and humiliated the world's most powerful man. The age of the untouchable spy plane was over, replaced by the reality of the powerful S-75 Dvinam missile, which had just become the most famous weapon in the Soviet arsenal. The final act would be the show trial of the captured pilot, a symbolic capstone to the spectacular propaganda victory. August 17, 1960. The Hall of Columns, Moscow. The Soviet Union staged its triumphant final act, the show trial of Francis Gary Powers. The Hall of Columns, a venue usually reserved for state funerals and major political announcements, was packed with foreign journalists, diplomats, and Soviet citizens, all eager to witness the official condemnation of the American spy. Powers, dressed in a simple, ill-fitting civilian suit, stood before the military tribunal. The charge was espionage. The evidence was overwhelming and presented with maximum theatricality. The wreckage of the U-2, the large, intact camera, the specialized survival gear, and the testimony of the pilot himself, extracted during weeks of intense KGB interrogation. The entire event was a meticulously orchestrated propaganda spectacle, designed not to determine guilt, which was a foregone conclusion, but to publicly indict the United States, its leaders, and its intentions. The prosecution used Powers' own sworn statements, detailing his CIA employment, his mission objectives, Tyuratam and Sverdlovsk, and the explicit instruction to avoid capture, as proof of a high-level, aggressive conspiracy directed by President Eisenhower himself. Powers confessed to his role, reading his statement in a quiet, measured tone. He admitted he was an instrument of espionage but denied any hatred for the Soviet people. His confession, though required, served the Soviet goal perfectly. It was an admission of guilt for the world to see. The verdict was announced swiftly, guilty. The sentence, 10 years imprisonment, 3 in prison and 7 in a labor camp. The symbolic victory for Khrushchev was complete. He had proven his technology, humiliated his opponent, and secured a captive symbol of American duplicity. However, the story of Powers' imprisonment was not the end of the strategic narrative. The U-2 incident, though a diplomatic disaster for Eisenhower, ironically delivered 2 lasting strategic benefits for the United States, benefits that were only revealed years later. First, the intelligence provided by the early, successful U-2 flights. The confirmation that the bomber gap and the missile gap were fictions allowed Eisenhower to resist the extreme pressure from the Pentagon to massively and preemptively increase defense spending. By knowing the truth of the Soviet arsenal's actual size, the U.S. avoided a panicked, unnecessary escalation of the arms race, saving billions of dollars and maintaining strategic sanity. Second, the loss of the U-2, coupled with the success of the Soviets' 75, forced the CIA to immediately accelerate development on the next generation of strategic reconnaissance satellites. The U-2 incident proved that no airspace, not even the stratosphere, was safe. By necessity, the U.S. shifted its focus to orbiting surveillance platforms like the Corona program. Within 2 years, the first fully operational spy satellite was providing intelligence that was safer, more reliable, and geographically comprehensive than the U-2 ever could be. The death of the spy plane accelerated the birth of the spy satellite, permanently moving high-altitude espionage into space, a realm the Soviets had not yet mastered defensively. The final chapter for France's Gary Powers came nearly 2 years after his conviction. February 10, 1962. Glienicke Bridge, Berlin. The Glienicke Bridge, spanning the border between West Berlin and East Germany, had become the ultimate symbol of Cold War exchange. On a cold, overcast morning, Powers was silently led across the bridge from the east. Simultaneously, walking from the west, was Colonel Rudolf Abel, a high-ranking KGB intelligence officer who had been arrested and convicted of espionage in the United States. The exchange, brokered through intense back-channel negotiations, was successful. It marked the first high-profile exchange of Cold War spies and brought Powers home. His return was met with complexity. Though hailed as a hero by the public, he faced intense internal scrutiny from the CIA and a Senate Armed Services Committee investigation, primarily for failing to activate the self-destruct mechanism or use the suicide pin. He was eventually cleared of any wrongdoing. The U-2 incident of May 1st, 1960 was more than just the downing of an aircraft. It was the definitive technological and political inflection point of the Cold War. It began with the Soviets mocking an American high-altitude dream, and it ended with the Soviets using a technological countermeasure to collapse the final attempt at diplomatic détente, cementing the new era of high-stakes confrontation. The U-2 gave Washington the truth it needed to survive the crisis, but also gave Moscow the weapon it needed to win the propaganda war. The lessons learned at 70,000 feet would shape global strategy for decades to come.